Hello, good afternoon. All right, as I get your names. Okay, I've slowly begun to correct finally, but I began with one class. And to be honest with you, I began with the class with fewer kids, kind of get the ball rolling. If you have not had anything corrected, you're in the larger class. I have almost 100 of you, and I know I shouldn't put that off, but yours is coming next. Um, So at any rate, also, I want to preface today's um, Zoom with another quasi um, apology, and that is, um, I I feel pretty good. I have connections with Spanish professors, Mexican American history professors, and I have about 5 textbooks that are pretty strong and highly reputable. But when it comes to the Spanish American War, almost without exception, they just do the context. So if you've caught on to what I do, right? I give you the context of what's going on in American history, and then I follow it with a micro view of Latinos, which to me makes sense. But in the chapters of these textbooks on imperialism, it goes over the just that imperialism. It gives only the context, and there's not much at all, if anything, on the plight of Mexican Americans, just in 1898 to 1902. So at any rate, what I do feel a little bit better about regarding that lack of a micro view of what's going on with Mexican Americans when we do this topic right now is that the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s constitute the progressive era. It was the same time as the Spanish American War. And then when we do the progressive era, we will certainly cover the plight of Mexican Americans, and it'll be covered at that time. But they always save it for the progressive era chapter, which follows chronologically. They put it and thematically after the Spanish American War. So I want to, kind of let you know that and apologize a little bit that this is kind of an exception and that this is kind of all just U.S. history, what we're going to cover today, and not much, if anything, on just Mexican Americans. But what I do feel good about is at this same time, their plight, their endeavors, their agency, etc., will be covered when we do the progressives next. Okay, so please keep that in mind, as this primarily is just U.S. foreign policy. Okay, so let's see here. And by all means, if you want to put a hand up, if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, by all means, I am open to that. Okay, I'm always open to that. So number one, I do what I try to do normally is I try to be as broad as possible and let you think for yourself. All right. So number one basically is court history. All right. And remember, court history is written by the winners. It tries to defend our leaders. It tries to defend our country. And if you know me well at all, you'll know that I'll take a revisionist route soon and be much more critical of the country and much more critical of the leaders. But I want to be well-rounded and let you objectively think for yourselves. Okay. So on this one, if you're going to defend the United States in 1898, taking Cuba for 4 years, taking the Philippines until 1946, taking Puerto Rico till this day, and taking Guam until the end of World War II in 45, 46, you can't deny that. You can't deny that we went to war with Spain and took these Pacific and Caribbean islands from the old Spanish Empire. All right, there's no mistaking that. There's no denying that. So what's the next best thing you could do if you want to defend our country? Is you try to contend that we were sucked into it, right? That we were pushed into it. We were the quiet guy in the corner of the room who wanted to mind his own business, and just circumstances larger than himself somewhat almost compelled him to get into the fight. Okay, so how could that happen? Well, it starts off this narrative in the realm of ideas. Okay. Um, and one thing about the realm of ideas is that it's difficult, and I grant that to the historians, it's difficult to prove how ideas that were certainly prevalent in academia permeated society. That's a difficult task at hand for an historian because most people still did not go to college. But nevertheless, it starts in academia with leading philosophers, scientists in, quote, Western civilization. And of course, that's an arrogant term. Western civilization is just, it's implying Western Europe and the United States. Okay. So, firstly, and then also what the adjective that I generically ascribe to these ideas, and I hope that I'm not simplifying it too much for myself and for you, but is dangerous. These ideas, if fully believed and if fully carried out, can have dangerous consequences if you adhere to them. Okay. So the big one of the day was social Darwinism, right? That kind of overlapped into many other ideologies and philosophical outlooks and so forth. So Huxley, Spencer, and these other gentlemen back in Europe, they took the ideas of Darwinism and they applied them to the societal realm. All right. But instead of lucky, random biological mutations giving some species an advantage over others to survive and thrive, with social Darwinism, it was all about choice. It was not about random mutations that are inherited by the population inside a nation state. It was about the leaders of the nation state and their decisions to constantly modernize is the kind of broad term they used. All right. So you see here, many other well-respected philosophers and scientists agreed with him that nuclear families, democratic republics, welfare capitalism, urbanization, mass consumerism, and industrialism were synonymous with modernity. All right. And so they said that the biggest thing that held people back was not biology, but was culture. And they believed that some cultures were very obstinate. They were very stubborn about change. So at this time period, an example that they gave was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was very progressive in the early modern era, and even just before that. But their time had come. They were kind of a decadent, crumbling empire from Turkey. And their imams, religious teachers and interpreters of Sharia law, had determined that certain technological improvements in the military were of the devil, and so hence you should not embrace them. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, thought the social Darwinists. Right? You have to constantly modernize, constantly industrialize, embrace technological novelty, etc. So then you had Friedrich Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche said basically that Europe had become decadent, right? Like Rome, the popular interpretation of Rome's fall, of its republic, that it had become too comfortable. And then there were people who had theories as far as rises and falls of empires, and they contended that they had like a very primal beginning. They had a very dynamic period of growth in every aspect, including imperialism, including taking over other lands that were not under their sovereignty. But then they get too wealthy, they get too comfortable, and they become decadent with consumerism, with comfort, with the creature comforts of life, and they become complacent, and they eventually fall. And also they become immoral, and they eventually fall. And Nietzsche was saying just that about that generation of Europeans. And of course, it was interpreted and read here in the US that people were afraid of that decadence happening here as well. And what he wanted man to do was to go back to his primal roots, become more militaristic, more aggressive in his foreign policy, etc. And so Friedrich Nietzsche had his say. All right. And again, as far as the danger of some of these ideas, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in the Genealogy of Morals, I'll never forget it, said, the problem with Christianity is its concepts of mercy and compassion. He says, it aims to artificially preserve what nature wants to eradicate. And that is basically the sickly, the infirm, the weak, etc., that they should die out. And that's some scary stuff. And of course, not to be hyperbolic, just strategically exaggerate, but it is true that Adolf Hitler embraced much of what Nietzsche wrote and thought very highly of him. Okay, so you have that. Then you had Lacombe de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain. And what they took was Malthus's writings. Malthus, I forget his first name, but at any rate, he's the Mad Max dude. He contended that the populations in the world at that time were growing exponentially, right? And so instead of 2 to 4 to 6 to 8, they're going 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, etc. He said that while the population of the globe was growing exponentially, the resources on the planet have been and will be finite. There's only so much water. There's almost only so much oil, only so much food, etc. And he saw this dystopian end that the Western civilization and the rest of the world were heading toward, where they were going to, in desperation, have to fight one another for scarce resources. And Gobineau and Chamberlain made it out to be a race war, contending that the European and Anglo-American Caucasian races were going to fight it out with the Asiatic races, the African, the Pacific Islanders, and so forth. Okay. So people are reading this stuff, and somehow they contend that, that there's evidence of the population at large embracing these ideas. What's easier to prove is that American leaders were embracing these ideas. They were learned men. Some of these people who were writing books incorporating this type of thought were literally passing them out to senators. And remember, the Senate has a foreign relations committee that has a lot of power with making decisions on foreign policy. All right. So look at here. Brooks Adams became a big writer here in kind of amalgamating all these thoughts. It says, urged the necessity of America reclaiming her martial or military spirit in preparation for the final competition of races. All right. And then I think lastly, I want to mention Alfred Thayer Mahan. All right. This guy right here. This guy had direct connections with leaders in the White House, with senators on that committee that I just mentioned, with cabinet members of the president, and with leaders of the Navy and the armed forces. All right. He usually is ascribed a lot of influence. Well, he wrote a book on the influence of sea power. And what he contended is that the United States needs to engage in not only a military buildup for the inevitable wars that will come in the future. He not only believed that there is safer security in being strong, and that's known as the policy of deterrence, right? Instead of winning other nations over, you make them afraid of wanting to provoke you, right? With the policy of deterrence. But he said that's not going to be enough. He says the U.S. needs to engage in aggressive geopolitics. All right. Aggressive geopolitics. I'm going to write that. All right, with aggressive geopolitics, what you do basically is you deal with contingencies, you deal with what ifs. You grab a global map and you look and you try to predict who your greatest threats are and where they come from, right? Then, in predicting such a threat, you try to be a step ahead of that threat by acting preemptively. Remember, preemptive strikes and preemptive movements, that is very ethically ambiguous as far as how morally right that is to do, right? Preemptive implies you hit the guy first before he has a chance to even take his hands out of his pockets, because you sense the threat from him, and so you get the advantage over him before he even gets a chance. Okay, that's kind of a far cry from Western civilization's adherence to just war theory that came from the Catholic Church. The good guy never throws the first punch in the Catholic Church's notions of just war doctrine. And we'll get back to that when we do World War II. But here, right, you look at areas that are key to your naval survival, because he thought technology was shrinking the world, right, drawing all nations in the globe together in closer proximity, and that most fundamental imperative battles will be fought on the seas. All right. So he was all about the Navy and a naval buildup. But he said that's not good enough, that you have to look for key geographical spots on the globe that you need to have some type of influence over in the event of that supposed threat, that supposed enemy nation in the future attacking you. All right. So, for instance, they considered the necessity of coal. The ships were steam powered going across the oceans, and they burnt coal as their main fuel. So a coaling station was like an AM/PM to go and fill up, right? So we aggressively pretty much demanded coaling stations with the Samoan and the Hawaiian Islands. And we told them they could not provide coal to anybody else, especially any European countries that could end up becoming our aggressor and our enemy. Another thing were naval shipyards. If we needed to fight at a moment's notice, we needed to have some ships already out in the Atlantic, already in the Caribbean, already out in the Pacific, etc. And again, you don't agree, you don't take no for an answer with these smaller island nations that are supposedly geographically pivotal for you in the event of a war. So you try the quid pro quo manner and say, we'll give this to you if you give this to us. But the issue is that if they said no, again, you didn't take no for an answer, and you began kind of extorting these smaller, weaker island countries. All right. So Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Tracy was all about his book, and he helped Congress and the Navy support a new modern Navy, a new steel Navy in 1883. And so in that year, you have the ships that are going to be the ones that later go down at Pearl Harbor, USS, and then they're named after states. Okay, so those battleships are created at this time in 1883. And notice we have no war going on. And for the first time, Congress gives the okay to extend $1 billion of federal government money, $1 billion into a naval buildup. Okay, even though we're at peace. And then I'm going to get back to the white man's burden. Okay. So what happens is supposedly yellow journalism runs with these ideas. Yellow journalism is a term for sensationalist writing that stretches the truth to engage interest and to manipulate readers. All right. So the famous ones were William Randolph Hearst and his newspapers, and Joseph Pulitzer and his as well. All right. So what they began doing is they began whipping up fear amongst Americans about injustices, corruption, bloodshed across the globe in different countries. All right. So, for instance, we had an issue in Nicaragua whereby the Mr. Rice was the ambassador to I can't remember his first name, but they were in the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, England, and our diplomats tried to put an end to that. We claimed, as you may remember, the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, stating that the American hemisphere, including Central and South America, and including the Caribbean, are off limits to the European powers. And supposedly, Mr. Rice laughed and said, your Monroe Doctrine means nothing on paper if you can't enforce it. All right. Then we had another episode whereby the Germans began forcing the Samoans into trade contracts, including coal. And we told them no one else but us. And there was other stuff involved. And the Germans really were kind of playing the part of the bully in the Samoan Islands. So we gave them an ultimatum to get out. And our navies faced each other. And luckily for us, the newspaper said, a hurricane came and kept us from fighting. And they said lucky for us because they said we were not ready technologically and logistically. We were not ready to take on the German Navy. Because as you may know, this was right at the time, the 1873, Germany united. And boy, Germany united with a bang, taking lands from Denmark and Poland and a couple other places, starting wars with France and beating them and building up a navy. So they definitely were seen as a bully in the U.S. press. And then you also had the episode, if you'll indulge me two more, you had the episode of the gentleman who had in our Navy in Chile, they were having technical issues with their battleship. So they went into the port of Valparaiso, Chile. They went into a Blue Lagoon bar. A scuffle ensued, and not even civilians, but police officers stabbed to death a couple of the Americans, sailors. And President Hayes demanded money and a formal apology, and the Chilean leaders refused to do it. And so what looked right is when you think about these ideologies that I've just discussed, right? Deterrence. The world is inherently hostile. That if you don't keep moving, you're going to get gobbled up and die, right? All this Darwinism stuff. When you adhere to that, showing weakness to the globe is the worst thing you could do, right? Because it's going to invite future aggression, that you're easy prey. And the press ran with all this. And then in addition to that, the last one I'll mention is the Itata incident, ITATA. That was the name of a ship or like a small, more like a boat. These were American and Cuban dual nationals who had moved up to Florida, left Florida to go back down into Cuba to fight the Spanish on behalf of their fellow Cubans. And so they were American citizens, but also Cuban. And they started to stop. They stopped, embarked, and they began taking out arms, guns and so forth, for the Cuban rebel cause to break free from Spain. And they were caught by the Spanish patrol. And instead of despite the fact that they called out that they were American dual citizens and tried to hope that made them untouchable, they not only did not let them off the hook with the letter of the law by helping, quote, treason in this Cuban rebellion, but they began executing them right then and there on the boat. And the newspapers just ran with this Itata incident. American civilians brutally murdered by the Spanish. So then, in addition to that, you have yellow journalism with the Spanish treatment of Cubans, right? And with the yellow press, they're going to run with a particular villain. And his name was, I'm going to wait on that. I'm going to wait on that, of them making villains of the Spanish. So then I give an example of Theodore Roosevelt and people like him who believed in the idea of the white man's burden. The white man's burden stated, right, that you could create win-win situations. You could proactively and preemptively take control of small island nations in the name of future American security, right? For places to keep your navy, store coal, etc., for strategic reasons. But you could then spend American dollars in modernizing those island nations. All right. And so some of the Christians of all denominations, they begrudgingly bought into this for that reason alone, saying, hey, we'll send missionaries there, we'll save their souls. So you see here, during such time of American tutelage, the U.S. spent $500,000 in a month in Cuba, paving roads, subsidizing railroad and telegraph construction, fixing the water and sewage systems, modernizing Spain's school system, and combating, quote, filth. A gentleman named Barber had Cubans caught throwing excrement onto streets, fined and publicly whipped, and fighting against disease with vaccine programs. So I'm going to wait on this. Some of this is redundant in the last section with the progressives. Okay. But look at this kind of condescending political cartoon. That's Uncle Sam telling the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans, the Hawaiians, the Filipinos, how to properly live like civilized people. And that picture says a lot. So then we have more of the details of how we supposedly got sucked in. This is court history again. All right. At El Galeon, Antonio Maceo and Antonio Maceo was a black Cuban who was like their George Washington, fighting out in the field. And then there was another gentleman, Maximo Gomez. All right. They and the other rebel Cuban leaders, because remember, they tried in the 1870s to break free from Spain and it failed. So now they're going to try again in 1895. They're going to meet at a place called El Galeon, and they're going to decide to engage in guerrilla warfare. Remember, guerra is war in Spanish, guerrilla is little warfare. So you hit the enemy on the flanks, and then you run and hide. You take off his supply, you cut off his supply lines, When people decide to side with Spain instead of their own Cuban island and people, you torch their plantations, etc. So at any rate, they not only agreed to that, but they agreed that it would be profitable to set fire to plantations of dual citizens, Cubans living there in Cuba, but who also had U.S. citizenship. And for a very manipulative reason, is according to the Fifth and 14th Amendments, anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. is entitled to all the rights, protections, privileges of citizenship, including in the Fifth, the right to life, liberty, and property. What does it mean, though, when they're overseas? Well, it's kind of been interpreted differently by different administrations. So when they try to do this, President Grover Cleveland says, nope, I'm not going to allow arson to pull us into this war. Okay. Then there was Spencer Pratt and another spokesman for the Cuban nationals, Cuban dual citizens, Americans as well. And they came up with the number 50 million. They said that they had $50 million in wealth and assets and property combined, Cuban Americans on that island. And that 50 million was greatly imperiled by this bloody, revolution or rebellion. Again, Grover Cleveland would hear none of it. Then some of the leaders of the intelligentsia of Cuba, who were for the cause of a free Cuba, a Cuba Libre, they came here to the United States, and they deliberately chose New York and Florida because there were a lot of Cuban Americans living in those two states. Jose Marti was kind of their leader. He was kind of the Thomas Jefferson of this Cuban free movement. At any rate, they formed committees, right? Juntas. And they raised money here in the US. They raised awareness. They had fundraisers and other drives, financial drives. They tried to enlist volunteers. And more than anything, they wanted American money to help back up their rebellion. All right. And then in addition to that, you have yellow journalism. And with yellow journalism, they make a villain of Valeriano Weyler. Because this guy, he found that he couldn't trust the countryside of Cuba. They would claim that they had nothing to do with the rebellion. And before his soldiers could leave, they'd be sniped by quite a few people. And so he took a hard-nosed stance in response, and he began forcefully removing the people from the villages and putting them in camps where he could keep an eye on them, where they could not do any damage to the Spanish army. But in these camps, they literally are behind barbed wire fences, and they were starving and malnourished. They were mistreated. They were neglected, and disease ran rampant in that, tropical environment. So look at this emaciated kid right here. The yellow journalist ran with this. And there's the butcher Weyler right next to him. This is Antonio Maceo, the military leader of the Cuban Free Cause. This is Jose Marti, their intellectual leader. And these are Presidents Grover Cleveland and William McKinley. So at any rate, Grover Cleveland still will not, he refuses to get sucked into this. And in comes McKinley. We have quotes from McKinley to the parting president, Cleveland, telling him he too did not want to enter this war. Okay, as they spoke with each other. But Kristen Hoganson has a book, and she contends that there was a spirit of the age, a zeitgeist, at this time in the US, as there was in Europe, that was permeated by Darwinism. And it put pressure on political leaders to appear manly and aggressive and strong. Because after all, if you're not, right, you're going to get gobbled up. So this zeitgeist was one of machismo, according to this book. Well, McKinley was already at a disadvantage coming in. He was seen as too nice, too indecisive. He was kind of seen as an effete, like effeminate Wall Street guy, a big business guy, friend to big business, no military background. At any rate, there was a guy named De Lome, and he wrote a letter to another Spaniard, and he said, I don't think we have anything to worry about. He says, this new president that came in has no backbone. Well, the British intercept this, and instead of giving it to our government, they gave it to our press, and our press ran with it. The Spanish call our leader, our nation's leader, a coward. Okay? Who has no backbone. And that was exacerbated by the fact that his own vice president secretly, and it got out, agreed that he had no backbone as well. And that's Teddy Roosevelt. So look what Senator Chandler says, who was a war hawk. He says, we will declare war in spite of him, in spite of McKinley. So Congress had the sentiment that our president was a wimp and did not want to go to war. And then you have the incident of the USS Maine that you probably have heard of. So with this, a famous Spanish bullfighter came to Cuba, and people from all over the world traveled to Cuba just to watch him. And so kind of like the Tibetans, when China hosted the Olympics, they took advantage of all that publicity with the Free Tibet moniker. The Cubans did the same. They tried to take advantage of all this publicity for the Cuba Libre cause, the Free Cuba cause. Well, the Spanish did a public crackdown right there in Havana, where the bullfight was. And they were cracking heads. They fired into the crowd. They arrested a mass number of people. And it just made them look very reactionary and very, kind of cruel. And note you that there were visitors, there were tourists there. So McKinley supposedly decides, you know what? We need to make sure, they need a physical reminder that the U.S. is watching them. So he sent the USS Maine into Havana Harbor and had it stopped there. It was there for about 6 weeks, and it was tense. At one point, the people of the USS Maine got out and invited Spanish diplomats to come in and dine with them to try to alleviate the tension and tell them, hey, this is just symbolic. It's just a symbolic reminder that be careful how you treat your dual citizens, your American citizens. Well, it explodes, right? It explodes, and it killed about 250 Americans. And what do you know? The U.S. sends in a diving squad, a scuba squad, and they find evidence of an inward burst at the hull of the ship. So that suggested that it was an attack from an underwater mine. The Spanish Cuba team, they found evidence of a malfunction with the steam engine to suggest that it was an accident. Well, the Americans didn't buy it. So much so that when we do go to war with Spain, people say, remember the Maine, the hell with Spain, was the battle cry. But look at this. Even after it explodes, look what President says. I do not propose to be swept off my feet. Look at this other quote. I must have money to get ready for war. I'm doing everything possible to prevent war, but it must come, and we are not prepared. Another direct quote from McKinley. So I put, therefore, it seems as if the American public, the popular culture of the time, the manipulative press, and pushy congressmen dragged President McKinley kicking and screaming down the path that would lead to foreign war and territorial acquisition. Now this next one, I take a revisionist turn. And I say, no, this president, there's a lot of great man history. I get it. A lot of focus on leadership. This president was an enigma. He was a puzzle. He was riddled with contradictions. He'd end up getting assassinated by Leon Kolgovitz. And he told the men to leave Kolgovitz alone and not hurt him as he was laying dying and worrying about how his wife was going to cope, because his wife had major anxiety issues and psychological issues and was heavily dependent upon him. So he dies in almost a martyr-like fashion. When other congressmen tried to get vicious with him when he was a senator before president, he made it clear that he would not get into the mud with them and go there. All right. You see what you've already seen about what he put up with. But here's where it gets interesting and confusing, is he gives Spain an ultimatum. And he tells Spain, you have a certain amount of time. I don't know if it was like 3 months. It wasn't long. You have a certain amount of time to either come to terms with the Cuban rebels or squash this rebellion. Otherwise, we are going to intervene. And what historians criticize him for is he had to have known that this ultimatum was unfairly out of reach for Spain. They've been fighting from 1895. Now it's 1898. If they can't squash them in 3 years, how are they going to squash them in 3 more months? Secondly, the Cuban rebels made it clear they would agree to nothing short of complete separation and independence from Spain. And Spain couldn't do that because you had all the sense of grandeur and prestige of the Spanish great empire. And there wasn't much left of it yet at this time. And supposedly it would have been political suicide back in Spain to just let Cuba go. All right. So at any rate, what seems to look good is there were parliamentary elections back in Spain, and the hard-nosed conservatives were ousted from parliament, and the Liberal Party prevailed overwhelmingly in the Spanish parliament. They were led by Prajedes Sagasta, and Sagasta made it clear, we need to compromise with the islands. We need to grant them some stuff. We can't just squash them. So that's good news, right? That he's coming in. So he offers them what are known as the autonomy decrees. It's a little bit of a misnomer because autonomy is like complete independence. And he didn't offer that. But nevertheless, that was the English translation. So in these autonomy decrees, I have read what I believe to be an offer that made that would create a situation synonymous with Canada under Great Britain. That in all things domestic, the Cubans would have their own autonomy. But that with the military and foreign policy, Spain would still lead them. So he offers these autonomy decrees. And an interesting fact is, while the Cuban leadership said no, thank you, the Puerto Rican rebels said yes. So the Puerto Ricans were ready to abide by this. And by the way, another island chain, archipelago, that said no to them were the Philippines. At this time, the Pope wishes to intervene. He sees war coming between the U.S. and Spain. He's afraid of it, and he offers to do his best to intervene and try to adjudicate, referee the dispute. President McKinley tells him no. So in giving this ultimatum that he had to have known could not be met, McKinley then asked Congress to go to war. So isn't that kind of strange? For a guy who was just kicking and screaming and did not want to go to war, for him to demand an impossible ultimatum to Spain. And then hence everything to do with the official declaration of war with Spain almost single-handedly mentioned Cuba. Cuba, 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 Cuba. But guess what? When the war began, we intervened in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines, ostensibly to help the rebels kick the Spanish out. But they were no dummies. They're like, okay, after we win and Spain is ousted from our island, are you going to leave, Uncle Sam? So there was an organization in the Philippines. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Katipunan, Katipunan. And it was led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and he was their great leader, a young man, military guy, one of the main two tribes of the Philippine Islands. There were mainly the Macabebes and the Tagalogs, and he was a Tagalog. At any rate, he asked for an assurance from the U.S. before we entered there that we would leave once it was done. And Spencer Pratt, the ambassador, as well as the leader of the Navy. I have his name down here. I can't recall at the moment. But also the leader of the Navy. They promised him verbally that the U.S. would leave, but they both refused to sign it on paper. And as you know, we don't leave either of them at the end of kicking the Spanish out. Now, with the Philippines, the initial excuse was that the lion's share of the Spanish Navy was stationed at Manila, the capital of the Philippines. And that evidently was somewhat true. But guess what? After we decidedly defeated the Spanish Navy at Manila, we began putting foot soldiers onto the main islands of the Philippines as well. So much for just wanting to take their navy out. Puerto Rico, because they had accepted the autonomy decrees, the soldiers were given a warning to try to acclimate to whatever situation they found. Hopefully the Puerto Ricans would be amenable, would be open to their arrival and want to cooperate. But if they didn't, they were told to fight them too. So much for just coming and saving the day, right? The Puerto Ricans, especially, did not ask for our help. The Philippines did not ask for our help and wanted a guarantee that we leave as soon as it's over. So then when it's over, this was known as a splendid little war because it just lasted from April to July of 1898. There were relatively few American casualties, and we got all this land. So hence a guy named John Hay said, "What a splendid little war," and the moniker kind of stuck. But the Filipinos, they met at Malolos and they wrote a constitution. And get this, the constitution was almost identically modeled after the US Constitution. So remember, if you're adhering to these ideas and in the name of social Darwinism, you want to make sure that these island people have the most modernized type of political system. How could you criticize them devising a system just like yours? A democratic republic. Well, McKinley denied the Malolos Constitution. Said, you guys are just Filipinos. You certainly can't, you're not ready for representative government yet. So I want to put you under a period of tutelage. Kind of like having a kid use training wheels before he could ride his bicycle. That we're going to start with overwhelming American leadership, and we're going to gradually pull out more and more American leaders and see how you guys do rolling yourselves. So there was a lot of arrogant condescension toward the Filipino people, because remember, at this time period, these so-called eugenicists. Remember, eugenics was connected to the Holocaust later on. Eugenics is the trying to categorize the DNA of human populations and trying to fine-tune the pool of DNA for future success. EUGENICS, eugenics. So according to eugenics at that time, the Filipino people were not up to par because ethnically they were Malaysian or Asian in a broader umbrella. And culturally, since the 1500s, they were Hispanic and lived under Hispanic civilization. So both by biology and by the Spanish culture, McKinley deemed the Filipino people unprepared for self-rule. Commodore Dewey is the leader of the military, of the Navy, that told Pratt we would leave, but wouldn't put it on paper. All right, it's McKinley. Now, a revisionist history. U.S. pursuing its economic interest even at other nations' expense. So what this points out, the type of image America is made into is an aggressive, imperialist, plutocratic bully. Remember, an imperialist is a bad word in academia. It's basically saying you're a bully. Okay? And plutocratic means that the government is in cahoots with the wealthy. In this case, number 4, with the big corporations, doing the corporation's bidding. So Colonel Charles Denby, he did his best as minister to China to open up Canton to American interest. He said that he wanted most favored nation status, meaning look at the country that gets the best economic concessions, which was England, from China. And America demanded that those economic concessions be matched for us as well. Then our diplomats got involved in trying to keep the Japanese out of Korea, ostensibly for the Koreans, right? Well, no sooner did we manage to keep the Japanese out of Korea for now, that we began making arrangements for our mining companies to be able to mine the Unsan mines of Korea, which were rich, and I can't remember, silver or gold. Then in China, the Boxer Rebellion was just as much against foreigners as it was against the Chinese government, right? They contended that their Chinese leaders had sold out to the Round Eye. And so we sent soldiers there in a separate sovereign country to put down a rebellion. American soldiers killing Chinese rebels. In Haiti, we had, let's see here, American bureaucrats armed and supported Hippolyte's, I don't know how to say that, internal Haitian rebellion against its uncooperative leader, Legitime, in return for a concession to the U.S. of a naval station and an American steamship's monopoly transit to and from America. Well, we helped fund this, and Hippolyte turned his back on us. He overthrew the other gentleman and didn't make good on his end of the bargain. And there were some in Congress that wanted to intervene militarily in Haiti to punish him. So we're playing these manipulative diplomatic games. And then, of course, in Panama, we had Zamuri, the Banana Man. We had Vanderbilt's railroads in the Cherokee province. And we had filibusters, Americans who were coming and trying to engage in piracy, basically, down in Latin America. William Walker was the biggest example. He basically took control of Nicaragua, a Southern American civilian taking control of Nicaragua. I kid you not. And by the way, if you want the dirt of this sort, I would highly recommend anything by Walter Lefebvre, L-A and then F-E-B-E-R. Walter Lefebvre, he gets the dirt. So at one point, we were in agreement with England to share the construction of an isthmus canal, right? I think an isthmus is like surrounded by 3 of its 4 sides by water. And we're looking for an isthmus geographically to minimize the needs of construction for a canal going through Latin America, instead of having to go all the way down the bottom, underneath the bottom of South America, Argentina and Chile. For commercial reasons and also for naval reasons. Well, we put down a rebellion in Panama. And Panama at that time was controlled by Colombia. But then, when negotiations soured over building a canal with the help of Colombia, we did just the opposite. And instead of thwarting a Panamanian rebellion for independence from Colombia. We armed and helped them rebel against Colombia and break free in independence. And what do you know? The first thing they did in return for our help is they granted the U.S. a 99-year naval lease to a width of 10 miles stretch through that region of Panama for a future canal. You look at the treatment of the workers, the Panamanians and other migrant workers there in Panama. I can't remember how many, but it was a lot who died. A lot got malaria, etc. There were accidents. But instead, I know when I was young, I was taught what a great what's the word, engineering marvel the Panama Canal was. And true, it was, but there was a high human toll to it. And by the way, in Puerto Rico, I don't know if I have that in there or not, but a lot of the land was sold to American corporations engaging in cocoa, coffee, and banana cash crop farming. And they paid the native Puerto Rican people very poorly to work in their fields. And inequity regarding land ownership in Puerto Rico, if anything, got even worse than it was under the Spanish. And then I try to end on a positive note and say that the U.S. truly believed in these ideas. They truly believed in the white man's burden. And they really did want to create a win-win situation. There's no doubt we benefited from taking these island countries economically, militarily. There's no contending against that. But that we gave a lot in return, or we meant to. See here, we said the problems with the Latin Americans is caudilloism. A caudillo is a local leader who rules by the charisma of his own personality. And when you go back to the Enlightenment, that's a scary thing, supposedly. You don't want people credulously following men. You want them following policies, the rule of law, constitutions, etc., supposedly. So it says here, the more highly educated classes of the population, I think it's talking about the Puerto Ricans, show little, if any, desire to subordinate selfish ends to public considerations. After centuries of effort to create such a public opinion, success has only been partially achieved. It is not remarkable, therefore, that when we turn to a country such as Puerto Rico, inhabited by persons having none of the traditions of self-government behind them, with temperaments more excitable, with a custom of valuing immediate rather than ultimate results, and with a characteristic firmly ingrained in them of emphasizing personal, family, and other considerations at the expense of the public interest, to find that these fundamental bases of real democratic self-government should be largely lacking. So it says here, Willoughby thought the Puerto Rican people must learn and expect self-restraint, tolerance, and obedience. They must expect their politicians, misspelled, to practice civic virtue rather than self-aggrandizement and party enrichment. They must learn to respect election results. They must begin to adhere to rational politics, which entails adherence to political platforms and policies rather than to individuals and their parties. They must not tolerate political machines and bosses. So under the Carroll Commission, They tried to bring in progressive leaders, build a public school system and infrastructure, and help agricultural industries, treat Puerto Rico as the U.S. had pre-state territories, but permit public political participation for the Puerto Rican elite. He likened permission for Puerto Ricans to jointly rule their island to a father allowing his child to get into the water to learn to swim. And I have there, nevertheless, that Puerto Rican powers were subject to American oversight is telling of America's condescending perspective that they truly were not yet ready to spread their wings and fly. Consequently, Puerto Ricans could run for city office and for membership in the lower national branch, the Assembly, but they were not initially chosen as provincial governors nor members of the upper branch of the national legislature, the council, which had veto power over the Assembly. So that's not giving them much power. Nevertheless, in a system of rewards and punishments, Puerto Rican politicians could count on progressively more offices available for them as they practiced good old progressive civic virtue, putting what's good for the general community above private or self-interest, which was supposed to end in eventual complete self-government. Then in the Philippines, it was likewise. They brought in a system of professors and teachers. What do they call them? Let's see here. The Sherman Commission were the leaders of it. The American occupiers permitted a Filipino national legislator to be elected to share power with an American commission. See, so we still put ourselves always in a position to veto what they did. And many appointed posts went to native Filipinos. At the local level, regional governors were elected, most of whom identified with the Filipino educated elite known as ilustrados, as were town council members and one member of the provincial regional boards, albeit the other two were handpicked Americans. This was a paternalistic endeavor to get Filipinos gradually accustomed to ruling themselves with American tutelage. It looks awful now. There's only so much I can do to defend this. But I'm trying to contend that Americans really, truly believe this. They really believe that the Filipino and the Puerto Rican people were not ready for this. And they wanted this incremental, step-by-step policy of giving them more and more power to rule over themselves, more and more offices gradually to be elected by the people. And this was terrible. They're known as the insular cases in the Supreme Court. They said where the American flag goes, the Constitution does not necessarily follow. That's pretty sad. There's nothing I could do to defend that. So hence, right, in a case-by-case scenario, we get to decide what constitutional rights the Filipinos have, the Puerto Ricans have, because they're not just guaranteed citizenship because the American flag has come upon them. We got rid of some of the Spanish things that were policies, like the cedula tax, the repartimiento, where they had to do public works. We took those away, which was a good thing for the Filipino people. Via the Cooper Act, American leaders bought Vatican land from the Catholic Church in the Philippines and sold it to the Filipino tenants, creating a sizable class of small landowners. So we did some good. It's hard. You can only defend this so much, right? And the ship Thomas, the Thomasites, this was the group of American progressives that came over in very, very paternalistic fashion to show the proper way of civilized living to the Filipino people. A lot of them came as teachers and as government consultants, etc. So then, in the name of progressivism, Woodrow Wilson will demand a timetable for the Philippines, whereby after a certain number of years, they get more offices elected, and by a certain number of years, the U.S. evacuates. So he put U.S. evacuation on a timetable. That was good, to let the Filipino people rule themselves. But again, the gradual part of it, the Thomasites there to teach them how to do properly things. Their lower house having a group of handpicked Americans who can veto them. You know, there's only so much I could do to defend the Americans. But the main thing I try to do in this last one is that Americans genuinely believe this. They genuinely believe they were superior to these people, and that they were doing good for them, and that they were preparing them for independence. That's about as good as I could get, because, like I said, some of it just looks awful. And you see there a school of Filipino kids. With their progressive teacher, American teacher. All right, does anybody have any questions? You guys feel okay about this? Can I get a thumbs up? Anybody? Thank you, Anna. All right. Let me make sure I have all the names. All right. Okay, guys, so that's all I have for today. All right, I will I will put this up. I might even just put it up as soon as I'm done with this Zoom meeting. All right, and so we'll be okay to just do one today, and then it'll be perfectly on time for the progressive one next Monday. Okay. All right, so you guys have a good day. Okay, have a good week. Thank you for coming, and you'll get your extra credit for this.